I've been painting in watercolors for many years now, and people have asked me many questions, but the one that really returns more and more often is what's the difference between watercolor tubes and pans? And this is a question that very often is asked by, especially by beginner watercolor artists. So in this video, I wanted to go through the differences and pros and cons of watercolors when you buy them in tubes compared to the pans. So let's start to see some differences, pros and cons, and let's start with the watercolor in pans, which are these ones here. So they come in half pans like the ones I have here, or in full pans, which is something like this, which is a bit dirty, but it's been with the other watercolors, so you get that sometimes. And this is an example of the half pan still in the wrap. And let's see what are the advantages of using watercolors in this type of format. Watercolor in pans are easier to use if you are painting in plein air, as they say, or outside. So if you're painting landscapes, you don't really want to have a bag full of these little tubes because they take a lot of space. I have a container here which is full of watercolor tubes, and you can see how much space they take. While if you take something like this palette in your bag, then you have here 48 colors and they take very little space. So, and then with the tubes, you have to use, of course, a palette, and you have to squeeze your color in the palette, and then maybe you don't need the whole amount that you squeezed out, and then you have to clean it off because it might be wet when you're going to go home, and you can't just put the palette in your bag like that. So there might be waste if you use the tubes as well. And yes, the space probably is the main advantage when you're painting plein air with the pans. Another advantage of the watercolor pans is when you take them with you when you're traveling. So if you take these little tubes in the plane and you put them in your suitcase, then because of the pressure that is in the plane, they actually accumulate pressure inside. And when you open them, there's like a little watercolor fountain coming out, and it goes all over the place. And believe me, I've been there. So when you travel, if you use the pans, they dry, they don't go anywhere. So there's less wastage, and again, they take less space in your bags. And besides, now with the restrictions, you can take these in your hand luggage instead of having to put them in your suitcase, which sometimes might be lost, and I've been there too. With watercolor pans, there is less waste generally, because sometimes the paint can end up in the around the cap here, or inside and all around, and it comes out and on your hands. And this paint is basically lost. Probably you can't really use this one. And also, even if you haven't been traveling, but when you buy new tubes of paint, there is some sort of pressure accumulated, and they're very full. And as soon as you open them for the first time, the paint will just come out, and then you will have paint all over all over the place, basically. So, I mean, if this happens, and if you have a palette ready, you can put it on your palette, and you can always let the paint dry in there. You can reactivate it with water, but then the problem is that you won't be able to wash that palette without losing that paint. One thing that you can do is you can have, see if I can pick this up, you can have these empty half pans ready. So if you have a new tube of paint, you want to have one of these ready when you open it for the first time, just in case it comes out, like too much paint comes out, you can just pour it inside your half pan and you won't lose it that way. Another thing that happens sometimes with a new tube of paint is that when you open it for the first time, this one has been opened before, but there is a gooey, sort of strange honey-like substance on the top of your paint. And what happens is sometimes you might try to get rid of it and you squeeze too much paint out from your tube, which I've done too, of course. One thing you could do is to try and mix that again, because that's the gamma arabic that has been separated from the pigment. And you can use like a blunt needle, like one of those needles that you use for knitting, for example, for sewing the knitting. So they're quite big and they're not as pointy, and you can try and mix the paint inside the tube. Some people try to sort of squeeze it back and forth. I'm not sure if that works. It hasn't worked for me, but there you go. And that's one thing you can do, but that's another sort of disadvantage, let's say, of the tubes versus the pans. Another thing that happens with the tubes is that when they are almost empty, like this one, then it's difficult to get all the paint out. So you can cut it, but I don't think you will ever be able to get the entire amount of the paint out of the tube. And also, the paint can dry inside the tubes. I mean, these ones, some of these I've had for many, many years, and they're still fine as long as you make sure that you close them properly. They are all right, but maybe if there is a little hole or if you don't replace the cap properly, making sure that it's closed properly, then it might start to dry. And when the paint is dry, of course, it won't come out. And you will have to actually cut open the tube and try to reactivate the paint that way. But it's kind of a messy type of job. So it's not very nice when this happens. I just wanted to give you a little tip while I'm talking about watercolors. It's nothing to do with tubes or pans, but if you get watercolor in your hands, one great thing to do is to use baby wipes, and they're fantastic at cleaning away the watercolor from your hands. So there you go, there's a little tip for you. Okay, so I've talked about the pros of the watercolor in pans compared to the tubes, but it's not all doom and gloom for the tubes. There are advantages to using these, and one of these advantages is, of course, that they are the paint is already soft, so you don't have to reactivate it. So in here, these paints normally needs to be reactivated because they are dry, and you can't just pick up the paint like this. You have to usually I use a little like a bottle and spray some water before I start painting, or you just have to drop some water in here and then pick up the paint. And when you do that, you need an old brush. I have an old brush like this, the other way. So as you can see, this is quite old, and because when you pick up the paint from the dry pans, or from the pans, it will be hard on the bristles of your brush. So don't use new expensive brushes to do this. Just use an old brush. While with the tubes, the paint is soft, so you can pick it up. I mean, I will still use an older brush to mix your paint, but if you need a little bit more color while you're painting and you just pick it up with your brush while you're painting, then it's not as bad to do this with the soft paint. And also, because you can squeeze a little bit on your palette and it's easier to pick it up, it's also better when you have to mix a lot of paint. So if you're painting a landscape, for example, and you need a lot of paint already mixed, a big quantity like for a sky or a background, then it's easier to mix a bigger quantity with the tubes rather than picking small quantities from the pans and try to mix it like that. It would take a much longer time. Another thing that I like about the tubes is that you have information about the paints, and when you're serious about painting, it's good to actually know your paint and have a look at the back. Let's see if I can show you. So at the back of the tube, there is there are some information. So this little black square that you saw there, this means that the paint is opaque. And I try not to use these opaque paints too much, but sometimes you need that particular color. But that would tell you that the paint is opaque, and it will tell you the pigment number. So this one is PY53, and it will tell you, so if there is one number only, it means that only one pigment was used for this color, which is better when you're mixing colors. I don't want to go too much into color mixing because that's a completely different video and probably small class. But if there are like 2 or 3 pigments making up a color, then when you mix this paint with another paint which has another pigment, you end up mixing 4 pigments or 5, and it's much easier to end up with mud. So try to prefer the paints which have one pigment. So that's why it's important to see what's the composition, and it will also tell you the light fastness, so how it reacts with the light, if it fades and if it fades with time. And what else? I think that's all the information. But you can find these in the tube, and when you have a pan of watercolor, once you take, because you have this information in the wrapper, so I don't think I can show you properly here. I might just put a picture, but once you take the wrapper off, because you're putting your pans in your palette, then the information is gone. I usually write the name of the paint on the side, but you can't really write too much in here. So tubes are good because you retain this information. What you can do to solve this problem with the pans is to do something like this. I always have a color chart that I keep in here, and so that's my color chart. So I put a swatch of each color, and then underneath I write the name and the initials, and I write the little symbol that shows me if it's an opaque, semi-opaque, or transparent color. So I can't put too much information, but I can put that, and also the letter, so the A or AA, that tells me how light fast the watercolor is, how resistant to fading it is. Another thing you can do is some strips of paper like this, where I just put again the swatch of the color. It's just a simple color. This is not a mix, this one. And then underneath I put the name and all the information that I find on the tube or the wrapper from the half pan. So I will have an idea of what that color is. If it's sometimes I write if it's granulating or not, because some colors are granulating and you may or may not want that effect. So this is a good idea to have some of these. You can have it this like this, or you can do squares like that. So something like that, again with all the informations on top that tell you more about your watercolor. And what I did in this case, that's why I have both of them, is that I start, let's see, I show you with one that you can see better. So I do this one wash here, two washes here, 3 and 4, and this also tell me the strength that the color can get to. So you will see how much the color will saturate. So another little tip for you. And one question that I'm often asked is there a difference between the two colors? So the watercolors in tubes more brilliant, or they last longer, things like that. But actually, there is no difference. The only difference that I know of is that the watercolor in the pans are dried. So very often the manufacturers will use the same paint. They put some in the tube and they put some in the pans, and then they dry the paint in the pans. I think that sometimes they dry it before and then put it there. I'm not sure of the entire process, but very often it's actually exactly the same paint. One is dried and one is not. For the rest, performance, as long as you buy artist grade, the performance is great with either of them. Another question that I'm asked is how to store the watercolors. What's the best way? And I don't think there is a specific way. Like with oil colors, you better put the tubes in a certain way. But with watercolors, I just keep them, like I showed you, in a container like this. It would be best probably to keep them at room temperature, and not in a place that is too hot or too cold, like in a loft, for example. There might be too much of a temperature variation if it's not insulated. But otherwise, I just keep them like this. And as I said, some of these I have them for years and years. And the same thing for the pans. Now, sometimes in winter here, it gets a bit humid in the houses. So the pans start to become soft, and they kind of hydrated a bit. And you can see if it's a bit shiny or not. I'm not sure if it shows with the light, but so in that case, I advise you, if you have such an environment, to keep them horizontal. So don't store it like this, because with time they would start to flow out of the pan. So if you have this problem with the humidity, even if it's like a hot climate and the watercolor doesn't dry completely, then store them flat. But other than this, there's not too many things that you can do to store watercolors. That's just fine. Actually, one thing I wanted to just add for the watercolor pans is try to, I know if it's as I was saying, a humid environment is not easy to do, and if you use them regularly, then don't worry about this. But if you are going to put the watercolors away for a while, try to let them dry properly before you store them for a long time, because they could actually develop mold, especially the Daniel Smith ones. I think it's these ones, they're made with honey, and they tend to develop mold more easily than the Winsor & Newton ones. That's at least what I found. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to say. But if you have any more questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and I will try to answer you as soon as I can. If you like this video, please remember to subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me if you do, and you can always share, like, and comment, and it would help other people to find and watch this video as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!